Boyfriend, Teenage Love. Written by Vella Jamar. Narrated by Deja, Nance. Chapter 14. Judy had been involved in a girls' club during the school year that was being turned over to a lady named Miss Kathy for the summer. She invited me to join, and I naturally invited Diana. Upon meeting Miss Kathy, I thought she was the neatest lady I had ever met. She was a single parent of 2 with a very clear vision as to what she wanted in life and how she was going to get it. She was really unique. She had her own house and every single thing in it was perfectly in place. We decided to give some parties, fundraisers, bake sale events, and a trip to Great America. We were looking forward to an exciting summer as we walked home and talked about the fun we were going to have. After arriving home, we hung out at Judy's house, laughing at silly things as we sat around their kitchen with Trina and brother Alvin. After leaving Judy's house, I went home and noticed my mother talking to someone who had either gotten a hold of her or she had contacted and convinced them about a small loan to fix up our raggedy house. The work was to take place over the course of the summer. I don't know where everyone was on the 4th of July, but I found myself home alone. Marcus worked part of the day. When he called and discovered I was alone, he came quick and made himself quite comfortable. Plastic was draped all over the furniture, awaiting the painters to finish painting. It was transforming into a nice-looking place again, as nice as it looked when we first moved in. When he arrived, I opened the door and we embraced and kissed in the doorway as I enjoyed being held in his strong arms. He was still handsome, and I still loved him, though the infatuation was not as strong as it once was. We spent most of the day talking, kissing, and hugging. He turned on and up the music and danced across the floor, showing off some outdated James Brown moves. I smiled and got a kick out of watching him. I went to the kitchen and fixed him a bite to eat as I watched him devour the meal, dreaming of the day I'd get to cook for him in our very own kitchen. When he finished eating, I turned off the music, and we settled for a few hours and watched TV. When the last movie ended, he got up and said he'd better go and find some fireworks for his little brother Kenny, whose birthday was in another week. We hugged goodbye after he told me he would be going to visit his family in Texas and that he may be gone a week or 2. We kissed a final time and he left. About a week later, it was time for our first party being given by our girls' club. It was okay, but not as good a turnout as we had hoped for. I was enjoying myself until I saw the girl from the gang who helped jump me earlier in the year. From that point on, I hung out in the kitchen. I was not going to get jumped by her and her goon squad again. I don't know how they found out about our party, but I did not want to get into it with that ugly bitch again. I sold goodies from the snack bar until the party ended. Diana kept urging me to come out and dance and not to be afraid of her. I decided the kitchen looked real good and real safe. Diana and I were together so much it was becoming more difficult to hook up with my baby. We missed each other quite a few times. Between dividing my time between the 2, there was still Trina who still required a babysitter. Diana and I found different things to get into each day after summer school. Her and Marcus were starting to mildly dislike each other, as one tried to pull me in one direction while the other tried pulling me the other way. One day after I came home from school, Marcus knocked on the door and wanted me to accompany him. I told him I was in the middle of going to the wash house to dry me and mostly Diana's clothes, and started walking around the corner to the wash house. He snatched the entire basket of wet laundry and ran. I didn't bother chasing him like he wanted me to, so he could lock me up in his clubhouse. We were planning on partying later on that night. When Diana arrived, she was furious that he had taken the clothes. When he returned, he told me that in order to get the laundry back, I had to go with him. She screamed, "Marcus, go get my clothes!" He basically ignored her. After they kept going at it in vain, we decided to find other clothes to wear to the party and get those clothes from him later. That was one of the times I was actually looking forward to going out. I had just seamed together some white pants and was anxious to wear them. I had perfected everything about making them except the buttonhole. Though it claimed to be summer, it sometimes rained during that time in our fair city. If we could get a ride to a party, regardless of the weather, We were off. We would get a ride home. We had become pros at picking whose car to jump in to get a ride from. I looked particularly sexy in my bright white pants, black body shirt, and short black coat. The guys always grabbed Diana the most, but I was right behind her that night. We were dancing all over that garage's dance floor. We had a lot of fun and were sad when the party ended. When I got home, there was my baby on the porch patiently waiting. He had partied as well and said when they suggested that everyone strip to have an orgy, he opted to go find my own baby and have my own orgy with her instead, as he pulled me closer. We kissed passionately. Nights when I had on my body shirt, he knew it was going to be a challenge to get me to let him take it off. I hated going through all of the motions. When he first realized I had it on, he expressed, "Oh shit." We both fell fast asleep from being too tired and it being too cold. When we parted in the morning, he gave me back the wet laundry. One evening, about a week later, while I was in a heavy sleep, without warning, Marcus climbed through my window. I don't know what in the world possessed him to climb back up again. My mother told him to keep his ass down. I was stunned after he touched to awaken me. He hadn't even bothered throwing a rock at the window so I could come down. The next morning, I went over to Trina's house where we met often at the break of day to chat. Her and Alvin kept looking at me riddling something about Spider-Man, and laughing. I didn't know what in the world they were giggling so hard about. Trina, bursting at the seams to let it out, exclaimed as she continued laughing, "What was Spider-Man doing climbing on y'all's roof last night?" I had no idea she'd seen him. I remembered hearing some yelling while I was asleep, but I didn't know if I was dreaming or really hearing something when he stole through my window. He didn't bother telling me that he had been spotted climbing our roof in the wee hours of the night after I had walked his hard-headed ass back downstairs to let him out. Maybe that is why he didn't want to go outside immediately. We stayed in the stair area a good while before zooming down to the overpass. I don't know what was wrong with him. He could have thrown pebbles like he'd become accustomed to. I was embarrassed and couldn't say a word as they kept singing the Spider-Man song and laughing. Trina was bold and said when she stepped out on the porch to smoke a cigarette, was absolutely taken aback when she saw a figure prancing across our roof. She said Christmas was gone, and she knew it couldn't have been Santa Claus getting ready to come down the chimney at that time of the year. She said he was up there a good ways when she began yelling, "Hey! Hey! Who is that and what are you doing? Get your ass down before I call the police." He must have been in shock and embarrassed, yet decided to take his chance ignoring her and hoping she wouldn't call the police. Upon hearing her fussing at someone, Alvin came out to the porch to see what the commotion was all about. I had to laugh after she told the story in the way that she did. Trina sure knew how to tell the hell out of a story. When I went home, I stopped in the backyard and found me a good long stick and placed it back in my window. When he came again 2 evenings later as if nothing had happened, I asked why he failed to mention that Trina had seen him on the roof and why he still hadn't learned his lesson. He ignored my questions and asked me to move the stick so he could come in so we could talk about it. I knew talking was the last thing on his mind and asked him to please climb down so he wouldn't fall or be discovered again. He continued ignoring and asking me to move the stick so he could come in. I too ignored him. He knew he was not coming in. After continued begging and my steadfast refusal, he made the journey back down. I felt guilty as he very well wanted me to. He was a pro at climbing both ways. I was no longer taking the risky journey. I threw on some clothes, grabbed my coat, and surprised him as he made the final step coming down. I tried hugging him and reassuring him that I loved him, but he could not keep climbing up to my room. He finally warmed up and held me back. He wanted to get out of the cold and asked me to go in and get some blankets, and which I did, and we stole away. When we parted early morning, I ran back home with my blankets and ran upstairs to catch up on a couple hours of sleep. Later on that day, Diana, Judy, and I went to Miss Kathy's house for our clubhouse meeting. We sat in her family room as she led the way in discussing the agenda. She was so meticulous and had every minute of her day planned right down to the last second. I was so glad that she found us worthy enough to make time for us. We used to laugh when we saw her with reminder notes all over the place. She warned us that one day we were going to get up in age and have them as well. It wasn't like she was old. She was only about 9 years older than us. At the time, we didn't have a clue of what she was talking about. Her house was as perfect as I had ever seen one owned by a black woman living in the hood, which was livable at the time. She ended up staying until the shooting began. She said she could handle everything except those flying bullets. After the meeting, we went to my house and grabbed a bite to eat, and hung out for the rest of the day. Later on, that evening, Marcus and his play cousin David came over sporting the Maverick. He was showing off as he pressed back and forth on the gas pedal. He said they were going to a party in Berkeley and didn't bother inviting us to come along. He came over the next evening without the car wanting to go to the clubhouse and was very disappointed that I was wearing my body shirt. Once inside the clubhouse, we fell fast asleep. When we woke up, we walked to the porch of the home that was behind my house. He asked me to braid his hair into 4 parts and told me that it was a privilege for me that he asked me to braid his hair. What an ego he had. It wasn't that big of a deal, though. I did enjoy braiding my baby's hair. That boy had more hair than I did. If I had pulled any of it out the previous summer when we fought, it had all grown back. I think both our stomachs were growling. He asked what I was doing later as he put his hat back on his head, satisfied with the job I did, and said he may stop by. We kissed goodbye and departed for the day. Judy and I went to meet Diana and Audrey later that day for a night of partying. We caught the bus and made the long trip to Oakland. After spending a joyous night at the New Age Club, we were waiting at the bus to make our long journey back home. As we waited for the 72M, we talked of going to another party once back in Richmond. When in Richmond, it was nothing for us to hop in different one's car and get a ride from one side of town to the next. We felt as long as we were together that no harm could possibly come to us. We also did a lot of walking in between when no ride came through, getting plenty of exercise. Everybody was in shape. As we were waiting that particular night, a car drove up with occupants whom we knew. We felt safe to jump in. It was, after all, 4 of us and only 3 of them. What harm could possibly be done? Out of all 3, the one most stupid, Johnny, was driving. He clowned us as soon as we got in the car and declared, "We are taking y'all to San Jose and y'all are gonna make us some money." Oh shit, we thought. What had we gotten ourselves into? Judy started crying like a big baby, tough as she normally was. First thing he did was drive to Highway 580, which was the freeway a lot further away in the hills. Judy was crying to Nate, saying, "I've been knowing you since I was in kindergarten and can't believe you are doing this to me." We couldn't believe she was actually crying. We were bold and said, "We aren't doing any such thing." Nate's cousin Johnny said, "Well, y'all are gonna get your asses out then." "Stop the car and let us out," we yelled. Judy, still pouting like a baby, climbed out with us as we began walking off the exit at Seminary Drive, far up in the Oakland Hills. We were nowhere near the 72M bus stop where they originally picked us up. We didn't know how in the world we were going to get home from way up there. As we walked down the exit, Nate, who took over the wheel and really did have a kind heart, drove up behind us and yelled, "Get y'all asses in the car." We climbed back in, still talking shit to Johnny, who was now in the back seat with us. We kept at each other the whole trip back to Richmond. He probably was a rough fellow to some of the girls. They would pick up but soften up since there was some history. I didn't know him, but his cousin Nate and I almost started seeing each other just months before Marcus and I hooked up. Nate hung with the knuckleheads sometimes, but it wasn't his true nature to be mean-spirited, which was probably what saved us. They dropped us off at the corner of 4th and McDonald Avenue. No sooner than he dropped us off, we hopped in another car with the guy who was flirting with Diana. She always brought our crowd a lot of attention and was the reason we got a lot of rides all over town or anything else she could talk them out of. He claimed to know where a party was. When Nate saw us jump in the car, he yelled, "See, y'all still haven't learned y'all lesson." As the guy took off, he looked puzzled. We laughed and were happy that we didn't have to walk. It was late. After aimlessly looking for a party, we decided to call it a night. We got dropped off in 2s, me and Judy, and Diana and Sister Audrey at their grandmother's house. Marcus and I must have had a clairvoyant connection. I knew I wasn't going to get in the house that late. As much as Judy's family loved me, especially Trina since I was her built-in babysitter. I knew that it wasn't good to wear out one's welcome. My grandmother used to say, "Short visits make long friendships." As soon as I stepped out of the car, there was Marcus. He said, "Let me go grab a blanket real quick, and I'll be right back," and was gone. I don't know where his friend Leon came from, or what in the world he was doing out of the house that time of night. His very religious parents would have skinned him alive if they knew he wasn't in the bed asleep. Their family went to church as much, if not more, than Marcus's family once did when their mother had complete control over them when they were younger. He was trying to convince me to, "Let's go somewhere," while I patiently waited in the cold for Marcus, who was back in a flash as promised. Leon was surprised to see him return so quickly and walked off without a word. Marcus asked what was he doing, and I said, "Trying to get him some." He uttered. We went and snuggled up under the nice warm blankets and fell asleep. We enjoyed being together until sunlight. He left saying that he had to go to work and that he may be back that evening. We wrapped up summer school and had even more free time. Marcus was working at the pizza parlor sporting a wallet full of money. He gloated each time he flashed it in my face. I don't know why I was scared to ask him for some. "Nigga need to pay," his grandmother would later school me when we became best friends. She'd say, "Girls these days are stupid. If a nigga didn't have any money in my day, he'd better not even look my way." She'd tell of her younger days. She was filled with a lot of spunk to be a granny. One day years later, we were at her kitchen window talking. As we looked out, she began nodding her head from side to side at her granddaughter, who had rode off the previous night in a van with some guy as she walked up the porchway. She said, Nigga done rode her all night and now she got to walk back home." I couldn't believe my ears. She and I both looked at each other and burst into laughter. She meant every word. She was one of those grandmothers who said what was on her mind and wasn't into sugarcoating a single remark. Afterwards, she said, "I may not have gotten my education, but I sure learned those men." She felt her granddaughter should have known them too at that point in her adult life. All of her lessons would go on to apply to everyone except her favorite grandson, who in her mind was exempt. It would take me years to start getting money from him. He was looking really good in his clothes and had actually gone out and bought a real leather coat. I guess he was going to be ready for Olita if she felt on his jacket again to inspect if it was genuine. Summer school was finished, and there was no reason to rush home at night while hanging out with Marcus. He had just finished his senior year. He didn't talk much about school anymore. He also wasn't talking about becoming a veterinarian as much, though he still got a kick out of his pigeons. We became bold, spending entire nights late into the next day together. The only thing that made us go home most of the time was our growling stomachs. One night after spending the previous night and the whole day together, Marcus wanted to stay the night again. I said, "No, I'm going home." Before I had a chance to completely dress, he grabbed my pants and said, "I'll be right back. I'm going to get something to eat." I was ready to go home, but he didn't care and ran out the door with my pants tucked under his arms. I didn't know what to do. I peeked out and saw Judy's kitchen light on. I looked around and there wasn't a stitch of anything to wrap around me. What an ass. I crept to the porch and peeked around the side of their house to see if anyone was up at my house. I was hiding in the bush on the side, just like Adam and Eve when they were hiding from God in the Garden of Eden. I didn't know how in the world I would explain my missing pants, but I guess I would think of something. Before I could make another step, Marcus was back. He laughed and said, "Where are you going with no pants on?" We went back inside and I bopped him gently on his head for taking my pants. "I told you I'd be right back," he said as he devoured a sandwich and asked me if I wanted some bites. He locked the door. After talking much about nothing, we fell fast asleep. We were used to being in each other's arms without always having to engage sexually at that point in our relationship. We didn't always have to make love. In the morning, we left, leaving his blankets behind, which he did quite often. I guess he figured we'd be back to use them. He walked me to my front porch where we shared some more kisses before he left. I knocked on the door and went inside and took a long hot bath. Back at his old clubhouse later on that week, he wanted to spend the rest of the day and the night together. He talked about everything under the sun as I listened to him. We finally drifted to sleep. The next morning, we were famished upon waking and wanted to get home as soon as possible. We heard his brother's girlfriend, Gail, whom had a baby by his brother, outside singing happily while hanging out her clothes on the clothesline. She had recently moved out of her parents' home. He tried waiting until she finished, but she was taking a long time. He decided he was going home and left after telling me to wait until she finished before leaving. They had a few words when she saw him, and then I heard them say bye to each other. I waited patiently, all to no avail. She probably couldn't wait for him to leave, and came to the clubhouse to see if she could find any parts of a joint that may have been left behind. When she saw me, she exclaimed, "Should have known Nasty wasn't back here by himself." We laughed as she searched. When she didn't find anything, we left. There was no need of hiding any longer since I had been discovered. I went home, bathed, and headed to Diana's and my little sister's skates, which were big enough for my big feet. She grabbed her older sister's skates, and we did a few rounds circling the block. Two older guys noticed us as we kept rolling by. They began flirting. We stopped and everyone introduced himself and herself. It was as if we already knew each other. Mac was particularly friendly. We found out later that he worked with troubled teenagers. Maybe that's why it was so easy to talk to him. Not because we were troubled, but because he had a way of relating to teens. The first thing that caught most of the guys' eyes we met were Diana's big boobs. No one understood why they were so big. She was skinny as a pole. Uncle Mac, who worked with teens, was placed in the low-class motel that they were sitting in front of as a result of a small house fire. He was immediately attracted to Diana. She was not afraid to talk to anyone, and somehow talked him into buying a whole bottle of Tyrolia for a planned night out at the New Age club that we were in love with. I later found out that he was also Marcus's uncle on his father's side of the family. Later that week on Friday night, of course, we stopped by his hotel room and he gladly handed us the big bottle of alcohol as promised. When me, her, Judy, and Audrey got on the bus, one of us flirted with the unsuspecting driver and put in everyone's bus fare. At the same time, another one of us whisked by with the bottle so he wouldn't see it and hurried to the back of the bus. When the flirter finished with the driver, she joined us. Some guys who were also traveling to Oakland started flirting with Diana, and she asked them if they'd like a drink. They said yes. A foam cup was given to them, and they drank themselves merrily all the way to Oakland. I did not want anything to do with drinking since my E&J incident. When we arrived, we had another exciting night as the bright lights spun, and we danced all over the dance floor. Another evening, we were about to party hardy. We ran into an old-school chump named Brad who was driving alone and looking to get off into something. It was perfect. We'd met him years earlier in elementary, and he was a very friendly young man that, despite his thick Coke bottle eyeglasses, still thought he was cool. He managed to keep some kind of hoopty, no matter what the condition. As long as it ran, he was rolling. We hopped in and told him of a party we had heard about. When we went to knock on the door, the ugly girl from the gang who jumped me earlier in the year pulled the curtains back and saw us. Me in particular. As our eyes met, hatred filled hers quickly. That gave us just enough time to get downstairs, back into the car, and lock the doors. She gathered her gang members to fight. I don't know what her drift was. She was ugly as could be, had no self-esteem, and wanted to go around beating up people for no reason. One girl they had beaten pretty badly refused to come outside. Boy, was I ever grateful to Brad that night. He asked why we had come back so soon. He was in the midst of parking the car so he could join us. We told him to start the car so we could go find another party, and that it wasn't a good one after all. As we were leaving, she and her goon squad came outside ready to fight. We left in the saint nick of time. We rode around in vain and ended up going to a burger joint and calling it a night. It was nearing summer's end, and I needed some new clothes to start off the school year. I went to the mall to swap a few old outfits for new ones to get started. I used to go alone. I don't remember when I broke the news to Diana, but she was just as slick, if not slicker, than I was. I wasn't doing it as much as I once had since becoming an accomplished seamstress, but I was still active on special occasions, and the beginning of school was definitely very special. I stretched the money I received from the college program to buy items that were impossible to trade, such as fabric and some accessories, looking for the best deals. We wrapped up going to a few more outings at the New Age Club and began getting ready for our final year of high school. I hadn't seen Marcus for a couple of weeks and began to wonder what had become of him. He didn't usually let that much time go between visits. I was actually missing him. He had grown to be a big part of my life, so I guess it was normal. I hung with Diana quite a bit, but I always had time for my Marcus. Late one night, while in a deep sleep, I awoke to his usual pebble throwing. He whispered in as low a tone as possible not to wake my mother. I couldn't quite hear him. After more persistence, I gathered. You probably are wondering why I haven't been around. I no longer stay around the corner and am now living with my grandmother in North Richmond. He told me to get a pencil and write down his new number. As he was preparing to give it to me, my mother, who must have been listening all along, yelled, "Get your ass out of here!" Astonished, he walked to the side of the house to give her time to get back in bed. A few minutes later, he emerged to give me his grandmother's telephone number, using sign language, and to wave goodbye. We bid each other good night and I went back to sleep. I called him the next day, and we caught up on each other's agenda. I asked him why he moved since he was so near 18 years of age. He basically said that him and his mother's relationship was to the point where it couldn't take any more strain. He said Raymond had put on his new clothes that still had the tags on them, and when he told him to take them off, she jumped in, started fussing at him and yelled, "Stop being so selfish!" He said he bought the clothes with his own money, but that she implied his grandmother had purchased them for him. Marcus said he felt he should have had at least been able to break in his brand new clothes by wearing them first. He said he decided to go where it was bound to be more peaceful with his grandparents. He and his grandmother were already best friends and got along like two peas in a pot. He was ecstatic to be living out there with her. He loved her so much. His face would literally light up whenever he talked about her. A few days later, he called and told me to catch the bus to North Richmond. I heard a few bad things about North, but never had any reason to go. His grandmother was out of town, and he was very anxious for me to come. I got dressed in my newly seamed outfit and caught the bus to his new house. When I arrived, he was nowhere in sight. I was very disappointed, to say the least, and really felt very awkward waiting around in unfamiliar territory. Marcus had no attention span whatsoever. I called him from the phone booth at the corner store. Still no answer. After walking back and forth from the store to his house several times, I decided to get back on the bus. I didn't know where he was and felt uncomfortable at the sight of all those thugs hanging out. They seemed to be everywhere. I couldn't stand the ones by my own house so intensely that I would walk around the corner from the opposite direction just to go to the store. Anything to avoid walking by them. There were too many hanging out, selling their street pharmaceuticals. By the time I got home and phoned him, he answered and asked, "Where are you?" I told him I came, didn't see him, and I just got off the bus from coming, and would not come back unless he had the bus fare to reimburse me. He said, "I don't have any money. Can you please come back?" Tired from the long day, I said, "No, baby, we'll meet another time." I stayed home and seamed together another outfit. Diana's big sister encouraged us to add heels and a purse to our wardrobe because we were becoming young ladies in our last year of high school. Off to the mall, we went in search of a purse and some high-heel shoes. It was a task searching for just the right look and the right height shoes. After all, they were our first pair. After a few hours of seemingly searching in vain, we both found a pair that we were pretty comfortable with. We decided to walk home in them from the bus stop. Boy, did we have the time of our life trying not to fall. When I got off the bus, I wobbled in the air and walked the short distance home. When Judy first saw me walking, actually trying to walk, she laughed hysterically as she hollered for everyone to look at Tandy in those heels, y'all. Look at Tandy trying to wear some heels. Embarrassed at being the focus of her hilarious attention, I rushed inside the house and put on my regular shoes. She had walked in heels for years and thought she was some kind of pro. She came over and gave me a few pointers on the proper way to walk. Marcus called me the next afternoon and told me to catch the bus to North. When I arrived, he was at the bus stop waiting for me. We walked to his grandmother's house holding hands and hugging real tight, as if we had just met and fallen in love. He opened the door, stood back, and allowed me to step in first. He then whisked me off the floor and twirled me around in the air, smiling his beautiful grin with his still fine self. He then proudly showed off his new home. His grandparents weren't there, and he couldn't wait to show off his bedroom in particular, of which was the last place in the house I wanted to see. He backed me up against the wall, and we began kissing passionately. He was trying to do his nasty business while I held him off. I was happy to be with him out of that cold, dreary clubhouse we had become accustomed to over the years. With his one-track mind, he kept trying to do the nasty. I rushed into the dining room and sat down, demanding something to eat. He couldn't cook worth shit and found some quick snacks. We sat down and munched together. It was a lot different than the norm. We were actually sitting in a real house. Over the years, we had made our way to my house a few times, and his mother's home even fewer. After we finished munching, he sat on my lap and seemed ecstatic to be entertaining somewhere other than the clubhouse of his. He hadn't locked the door, and his neighbor from across the street walked in as we were in a deep kiss, wanting to borrow a cup of sugar. He said she was one half of a twin and didn't bother introducing us at the time. After he gave it to her, he rushed her to the front door and locked it to ensure no one else walked in unannounced. We looked at nature movies most of the day. He still professed wanting to become a veterinarian. If it weren't pigeons holding down his attention, it was some of God's other animals, which he enjoyed watching. He could look at them without moving for hours at a time. When the sun began lowering, I told him that I'd better get home before it got too late. He walked me to the bus stop and waited with me until it came. North Richmond looked a bit rougher than other parts of the city, but there were still a lot of decent people who lived there. Regardless of some of the things the younger crowd was doing, Marcus's wonderful grandmother had lived there a number of years. When the bus arrived, we kissed quickly before I boarded. I looked at him until the bus turned the corner and took him out of my sight. This has been Boyfriend, Teenage Love, written by Vella Jamar, narrated by Deja Nance.